Hello, everyone. We're so happy you're joining us today for another episode of Inside College Admissions, a podcast powered by Scoir. My name is Ashley Smith. I'm the marketing director here at Scoir, and today I am once again joined by Peter Van Buskirk to have a conversation that we're calling a temperature check on college admissions. This is the second conversation in this mini-series and is intended to give you, our listeners, an update on the most recent conversations we're having with those who work in the world of college admissions. But before we dive in, I'd like to give a warm welcome back to Peter.
Thank you, Ashley. It's good to be with you.
Always great to have you here, Peter. And for those of you who haven't listened to our first episode on a temperature check on college admissions, we'd like to give you some background on how this came about. So Peter is the owner and founder of Best College Fit and a strategic advisor for Scoir. And every year he hosts an event called the No Name Conference, where admissions leaders from across the country come together to talk about a lot of things in the college admissions space. So our goal today is to give you a recap of some of the overarching themes that are coming out of these conversations, but I'll leave it to Peter to fill in any other gaps that I may have missed from the intention of the conference itself.
Well, thank you, Ashley. And before I do that, I just have to comment on the title here, the temperature check. I think that in college admission, for much of that time we've done this conference over 30 years, the temperature has been 98.6 all the way, mild fluctuations. But I think the coronavirus this year has really jolted the system so that there are some pretty serious fluctuations in temperature, even in the last few months. But the No Name Conference has been a wonderful tradition that was established, again, about 30 years ago. With a couple of colleagues, I pulled together a group of deans of admission and pretty well-traveled secondary school counselors and some independent consultants to take a look at the year gone by, what's happening, what's good, what's not so good, what do we see over the horizon, and so on. And it turns out it became pretty popular. We do these sessions in 2.5-day schedules so that we can sit around a conference table. There's no presumed expert. Everyone's an expert. But along with my colleague, I facilitate the conversation on different topics. And it just gives everyone an opportunity to unload, if you will, and to think forward and project the kinds of things that they might imagine into the future. So the last couple of years have been tough because in 2020, we had to cancel the name conference because of COVID. And out of an abundance of caution, we decided that 2021, we should cancel as well. This year, however, we decided to try a series of webinars, now we're calling them video conferences, with members of our group who would like to join in the conversation. And it's been remarkably well received. Normally, when we do in-person programs, we have 30 people representing different backgrounds educationally at the table for facilitated sort of a think tank conversation. Well, now we have 2-hour sessions, and it's kind of hard to get everybody's voice in 2 hours, but still, we really enjoyed the opportunity, at the very least, to see each other and do, as you say, the temperature check.
Mm-hmm. Even if it's just through the screen, right? It's just a nice way to get people together.
Exactly. Even for people who are all Zoomed out this year, the Zoom can bring us that gift.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that being said, let's get right into it. I'm curious. I know that you recently just had the second, I believe, out of the series of 3 of your virtual events conferences. And, there's a lot of things taking place now that we're towards the end of the first quarter, towards the end of March, and, a lot of news about the vaccine and other things that are more positive than they have been in the past related to the pandemic. So I'm just kind of curious, was the group a little bit more optimistic, or what was the mood of the group during this last conversation that you had?
And first, I have to correct you. Because of the interest in this conversation, we had to expand to 4. So this is the second of 4 sessions.
Wow. Okay, great.
I would say real quickly, it was pretty clear that there's a level of exhaustion that's setting in so far. If you look back, literally a year to the point at which COVID became real to the world, and it wasn't just something that was happening in another part of the world that wouldn't affect us when we were all in it. The whole concept of the pivot, the notion that high schools would have to figure out some way to get kids to the finish line of their high school academic year, colleges would have to do the same thing. It was a real test of ingenuity and innovation among educators, really, and at a time when they couldn't huddle around a table and do things together. So they had to immediately work remotely on solving a problem that they'd never seen before. And I think that the effect has been a very positive one. However, when I say people are exhausted, it's just been a long haul. It's been a marathon, especially for folks on the college side. On the secondary school side, the guidance counselors and the college advisors have had to make some pretty serious adjustments as well. The lift isn't quite as heavy for them as it would be for, say, the deans of admission and their staffs, who are having to not only select a class, but recruit the class and do all the things in between. So I think right now folks are feeling a sense of some relief that we're almost to the finish line of this current admission cycle, and feeling that, gosh, it's going to be great when we can open our campuses fully again. A number of schools have experimented with partial openings. Some schools have been fortunate to be open all year, but under pretty stark circumstances in terms of social distancing and that sort of thing. But I think that everybody's just yearning for that moment in time when things are open and the traditional campus tours can start to take place and the information sessions. And I think there's still, unfortunately, uncertainty about what the calendar is going to look like in that regard.
Sure. So you touched on something that I wanted to ask you about, which is obviously at this point of the year, there's been a lot of activity from, the fall up until this point. So can you give us any insight in terms of what the admissions team's perception is going to be for this yield season?
It's a great question, Ashley, and I think that the reactions will vary according to institutions, and if we kind of look at institutional types by selectivity and break them down from the sort of uber selective, I hate to attach titles to like best or top, because I just think that they're false and misleading. But if we talk about schools in terms of their selectivity, maybe those that are admitting, say 30% or fewer of their applicants is one group. Another group would be those admitting 30 to 60% of their applicants. And then the balance, and most of American colleges and universities are admitting more than 60%. They're relatively open in the college admission process. For that last group, every year is a scramble. And this year is going to be an even greater scramble, because there's always a trickle down effect. Whichever students don't settle in at that first, the most selective group of schools, will trickle down to the second most selective group of schools, and then to the relatively open admission. So that last group is going to always be a struggle. And it's kind of, for whatever reason, kind of popular for people to speculate about which schools aren't going to make it.
Yeah.
Typically, the schools that have the greatest challenge in any time, but particularly a time like these where there are real market constrictions, will be those schools that are among the less selective. And they're probably the less visible as well, unless they happen to be in your community. But the schools that have some degree of selectivity or a high degree of selectivity are doing okay. And I'm going to skip now to the most highly selective, because they'd get all the notoriety. Many of those institutions this year experienced great increases, not small, but great increases in the numbers of applications received. I know that you wanted to talk about this in perhaps another conversation or another question, but many speculate that and justifiably so, that the increase of the test option has had a real bearing on pushing a lot of kids, and the psychology of that's fascinating, toward those most selective schools. Those places are going to be running wait lists well into the late spring and summer, as will the middle group. The middle group is probably going to be fine, but their tendency, this is the group that might be admitting 30 to 60% of their applicants, they'll tend to over admit a little bit because they don't know how to predict the yield on their offers of admission because of COVID. There's a tendency for families to stay a little closer to home with the pandemic than to venture out than they might have before. So those schools will have over admitted in the regular admission process. Many of them will also have, if you will, over admitted in the early decision process. in an attempt to try to secure as much of the class early on as possible, and still have probably put more students on waitlist this spring than would have been in the past. The waitlist, if you will, is like an insurance policy. If we don't get the class with those we admit up front, we go to the waitlist. So it's going to be a very fluid situation for a lot of students who are looking at that middle group of schools, the 30 to 60% admit rate schools, and that'll probably be pretty fluid right up into the middle of June. The most selective schools are trying to deal with an unusual phenomenon. They've always been incredibly selective, some admitting as few as 1 out of 20, but many of those schools, the 1 out of 20 admit schools, saw increases of 20 to 40% in their applications this year. So maybe they're admitting 1 out of 30. And that just kind of breaks all the predictive modeling that they could do based on past years. So my sense is that they may not have admitted many more students than they would normally, but their wait list will be longer. So if you end up on a wait list in the spring of 2021, it is not over. It's just game on into extra innings, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm wondering, and you tell me if I'm off base here, but the wait list, does that play into what the admissions teams would reference in terms of like summer melt to people deciding not to come? Do they then go to the wait list in those scenarios? Can you kind of give us some insight around that as well?
Sure. And the notion of summer melt, for those of you who are just hearing it for the first time, is the reality that any institution will see a percentage of students who have made an enrollment commitment back out of that commitment, sometimes for personal reasons, health reasons, financial reasons, sometimes a change of heart with regard to where they ultimately want to attend, or there's a lot of reasons that can contribute to that. But the summer melt is that expected attrition from the if you will, the gross enrollment. So
Mhm.
when colleges and universities are planning their enrollment activities right now, they're shooting for the class plus a factor, and that plus factor represents the summer melt. So when I was being dean of admission, we knew that we wanted to settle with a class of 500, but we would target 560 because we knew historically we would tend to lose approximately 60 students over the summer. So colleges will be doing that. Now, to answer your question, the enhanced waitlist activity has always factored that in and will factor that in again this year.
Got it. Okay. Well, you also touched on something in reference to the wait list that, as you mentioned, I do want to get into a little bit, and that is related to being test optional this year. Obviously, we've seen more schools do this than ever before. Can you give us some insight in terms of what the conversation was related to that, how that impacted the number of applications submitted, what their feeling about that whole process was?
Well, it's interesting that the most selective schools recognize big bumps in their applications this year, and I think they will attribute those bumps to the impact of the test option. What's interesting then is to kind of look into the psychology of it all. Why would that happen? And we heard an awful lot from secondary school and independent consultants who deal with the students who are making those decisions, and it drove them nuts because there were a lot of students who came into the process with unrealistic expectations about the most selective schools. And now that those most selective schools were making the submission of tests optional, those kids were saying, well, without having to worry about the test, I have a better chance, don't I? I'm going to go ahead and apply.
Mhm.
And the answer is no, you don't have a better chance. I'm fast forward then to say that those most selective schools are pretty savvy at discerning the level of sincerity in a candidate, as well as the level of academic preparation and ability to rise above the rest. So yes, schools that were admitting 1 out of 20 might have gone to 1 out of 30 this year, but I don't feel too badly for them because they're able to discern pretty quickly who the really serious candidates are. But yeah, the impact of test optional was to attract a lot of unrealistic candidates into applicant situations where they simply didn't have a very good choice at all. Now, that said, there were a lot of really heartwarming stories of students who were able to apply to schools without submitting tests. And in this case, maybe students who were coming from disadvantaged background, marginalized students, et cetera, for whom the test would have been an obvious bias against them. But without the test, were able to present themselves in a more meaningful and positive So there was a plus side. There were some opportunities for students who might not have cracked the admission at some of the most selective schools, having some opportunity. But frankly, given the incredible volume of candidates, those exceptions were far and few between.
So, something else too, obviously related to this is the impact of early decision and colleges wanting to, potentially extend that to more students so that they could be more certain on what their numbers would look like for the year. So, what would you say the biggest difference was this year for early decision, and what was the impact of that on the overarching admissions process?
Well, I'm not going to mention names of schools. I just don't think that would be appropriate. But I can tell you that many schools, especially in that somewhat selected, the 30 to 60 range, used early decision strategically to build as much of the class as possible. Prior to this year, it wasn't unheard of for a college or university, in that moderately selective to highly selective, because there's some very highly selective schools that did this too, to admit close to half of the class through early decision,
Hmm.
which has a real impact on regular decision. It just eliminates by the hundreds numbers of students that can be admitted in regular decision. This year, I'm familiar with at least one school that went above 60%.
Oh,
In
wow.
terms of, yeah, and what that means is the students who applied regular decision to that school might have thought they were looking at having an opportunity, maybe a 1 out of 3 chance of getting in. Well, their chances were 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 15, given the squeeze on that. And plus, many of these same schools are also looking at the regular decision candidates and saying, well, we like you, but we're not quite sure if you're going to come. So let's put you on the wait list. And if you're really interested, we'll take you from the wait list. Meaning that the selection of students from the wait list then is a high yield proposition too. Not quite as high a yield as early decision, where you admit one to get one, but it's almost as close. So the net effect again, Ashley, has been that the regular decision candidate pool at many selective schools is squeezed more and more and more. It's just insane.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And, while we're still kind of talking about the wait list too, is there anything for our student or family listeners here, if you are put on the wait list, do you have any quick words of advice for them based on, maybe if it's like your absolute top choice or versus a school where, it may not be ultimately where they want to go?
Well, as I advised a young man the other day, I said, and he was placed on a wait list at a pretty selective school. And I said, respond to them, let them know that you're the first choice school if that's true.
Hmm.
If it's not true, let them alone. Let them focus on students who are really serious about them right now. So, yeah, if you end up on a wait list, what you need to do, first of all, is let them know that you're serious about remaining active on the wait list, and that if admitted, you'll come. Because that's, at the end of the day, that's the primary consideration for schools when they admit students from the wait list. They may give you all kinds of explanations for how they only want students who are in the top 10% or have scores at such a level. But all of the initial rationale for wait list and placement on a wait list goes away very quickly, and gives way then to two basic considerations. One is, who can pay, because frankly, admitting students from the waitlist who need substantial financial aid prematurely, in other words, admitting them before you really know how the response is on the regular candidates, is pretty foolish, because it's one way an institution can go over budget with financial aid. And the other is who's going to show up. So what you want to do is provide that follow up to the institution that says, "Yep, I'm interested. Do you take me? I'm coming." And make sure they have. I think the key thing here is make sure they have all of your possible contact information, because they don't want to spend a lot of time trying to track you down. And if the day they want to reach you is a day that maybe you've gone to hang out with your friends, or maybe you've been able to finagle a weekend at the beach or something like that, they might call. Make sure your cell's ready.
Absolutely. Something that we have also been just putting, notes and other content pieces or whatever it may be is that, it's not infrequent that, and you can tell me if you disagree with this, that admissions teams will also reach out via email. So even though it may not be always the preferred method, to just make sure you keep an eye out for that from the colleges to make sure that you're not missing any key communications there.
I would agree. And the bottom line is that whether it's email or phone, you need to be ready with a decision, because they're not going to say, we're going to be able to accept you from the wait list. Do you think you'd be interested? We can give you 2 or 3 weeks to think about it. No, they'll want to know probably within 24 hours
Right.
that you're
Right.
going to accept that. And if you say yes, then they'll send you an offer letter, and they'll expect you to send your deposit in within like 3 days. So yeah,
So be
it's
prepared.
a very, very fast transaction. That's right.
Got it. So something else that you said that I thought was really interesting was related to some of the predictive modeling that goes on when admissions teams and colleges are looking at their potential class. Do you think that the predictive modeling for these teams has forever been disrupted because of COVID?
I wouldn't say forever. I
Okay.
think that we'll discover pretty quickly that with new data sets, colleges and universities will modify pretty quickly their expectations. I think that there's a concern among colleges that the next cycle for the high school class of 2022 could be a difficult one for them to manage as well, because they're just not sure how to predict the likelihood of enrollment for students. But I suspect that once we get through this next cycle, another 12 months, that things will settle down, and there will be another expectation that is generated by the predictive analytics that it probably won't be too far off what we've known for a long time, or what colleges have known, but it'll be different. But I think it'll stabilize.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess the thing that I would be paying attention to if I were on the admission side is whether certain trends that have taken place throughout these uncertain years seem to stay in place. For example, if the mindset toward applying to college has forever been impacted by this, and it'll just be, I mean, we'll only know over time, but something that comes to mind for me right away is, are students going to be less inclined to go far away, or are they going to maybe want to stay closer from here on out just because of the additional comfort or whatever it may be? So it'll be really interesting to see what plays out over the next couple of years.
Well, it will be, and I think students need to very thoughtfully and carefully take stock of how they like to engage in learning, because it could be that the learning environment that they would enter into otherwise are different than sort of the romantic notion of what it would be like to go off to college. And I think that they need to, again, reflect on what it is they want to get out of the college experience, and more specifically how they can get it, and then as they begin to look at colleges. And I would add, just kind of reflecting back on that particular comment, families have felt dislocated from college campuses, and the guidance counselors spoke to that extensively. Uh,
Hmm.
but it's also true that there is a rich mine of information available about colleges and universities on their websites. And it's not often that students are inclined to want to kind of burrow into those websites and ferret out really good information about academic programs and who teaches and what they teach and how they teach, and what's your dog's name and that kind of thing. But there's a lot of information that students can glean from websites, even though they may not be able to visit campuses.
Hmm.
I would add one more thing, if I might,
Sure.
this may be something you're going to talk about, so I hope I'm not anticipating it prematurely here. There's a real concern, speaking of enrollment, real concern about college readiness for the current seniors, and certainly even more so for the current juniors, soon to be seniors. And a number of reasons for that. Number one, many of them have been functioning in virtual environments, and there's a lot of evidence that kids aren't showing up. I mean, they might show up for the class at the start and put their avatar on the screen, and then go play video games somewhere else. So the degree of accountability for kids in general is really low right now, and I think that high schools are in a bind, because what do we do? Do we hold these kids back if we can't see that they've been actually doing the work or doing it well? Or do we find ways to pass them through? There's also concern that kids are cheating, that there are assignments given online, and kids are coming up with remarkably professional looking projects and essays, etc., in response to some of the questions that are being asked of them. So the integrity of the academic process is very much in question right now. And finally, schools that are looking at students for STEM related
Hmm.
academic programs are really concerned that the kind of progressive activity students would have in math, science in the junior and senior year simply hasn't been the same.
Sure.
And kids entering engineering programs may not have they'll have the ability, but not the right kind of preparation to step in and be successful the way they would have otherwise. So there's some real concern about what the transition into college is going to be like for kids this fall and next fall, given the unevenness of their instruction in high school.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm so curious to see what that will look like too, because I'm sure it's a very real concern for both the high schools and the colleges. I'm wondering what that would translate to in terms of, the impact. Is it students dropping out, transferring, whatever it might be? But I think that that's a great point, because at the end of the day, we won't really understand what that academic preparation looks like until they arrive on campus. And going to college for most students is a shock in normal circumstances. So what is it going to look like now? So that's really interesting.
There are two things I would say. One, I would just remind folks, if they don't know already, that in our country, there's an embarrassing statistic with regard to college completion.
Hmm.
Barely half of the students who start college in our country will ever finish.
Yep.
It's 55, 56% will ever get a degree anytime in their lives. So we're starting with a pretty low bar,
Sure.
and add into this mix COVID related mix where students are starting college on less sure ground with regard to their preparation. They will not have been in a traditional academic learning environment in high school for the last year or two. They might not be going into a traditional college environment for the first year or so. So there's real reason to be concerned about retention. The other thing that came up in our conversations pervasively throughout the conversations is the mental health of students,
Yeah.
and the way that they're having to respond to their what's going on in their lives in general right now. Obviously there are going to be some who are going to be fine, but as one counselor said, we're concerned about the hiders, the ones that turn on their screen for the class, but then disappear. And we just don't know. The schools don't know how to read these kids. They don't see them in the hallways right now. They as one counselor said, that we feel like our relationships are much more transactional than they had been for many years,
Yeah.
when you could see a kid in the hallway, maybe at an athletic event, at a musical event, and establish a broader rapport with that student, and have a better sense of who that young person is in life rather than just in the classroom. So there's real concern that that tendency to start but not finish could be much greater for a couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the statistics of, the less than great statistics about the completion rate of those who enroll in a college or university. And that was, one of the big reasons why Scoir was founded, actually, to help improve those outcomes and student success. And I think it's really important now more than ever to, as you would say, have that sense of intentionality and purpose in the college going process, and really paying attention to certain criteria, and maybe forgetting about the rankings or whatever it may be, and finding that place that is truly going to be best for you, so that academically it works out well, and from a mental health perspective you're in the type of environment that you'll thrive in. So the optimist in me hopes that the pandemic and the current environment will really help bring out some of those things in the college search process. But I do think it's something that everybody needs to be paying attention to right now.
Well, and along those lines, one of the great worries now among educators, and certainly people who were part of this conversation, is the future for the students who are marginalized, because they may not have the same access to technology.
Hmm.
With the test option, you're thinking, okay, that may help some of those kids, but that means that there's going to be a greater or closer examination of the work that they've done in the classroom.
Sure.
Fair number of them, a large number of them, are in schools where you know the instruction during the pandemic has been very uneven, and they've been doing it remotely, and the accountability is really low. So that from the college and university side, there are real questions about the integrity of the academic program in which those students are enrolled. So there's a concern that all the advantages that we've seen with regard to increasing access for the marginalized students may be lost for a period of 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge concern of ours, and I think a lot of people's, rightfully so. Two more quick questions for you, Peter, before we wrap up. We actually get this question somewhat frequently, and I'd love for you to weigh in on it. And it kind of goes back to our theme around being test optional. Because more schools are offering that, you kind of alluded to this. What are admissions teams putting more emphasis or looking at more closely now than what they have before when they did require test scores?
That's a great question, and it was a question that I pressed folks on in our session this last Friday. The very quick and easy response tends to be a little superficial. Is we focus more on courses and grades,
Sure.
which is absolutely correct. The coursework the students have engaged in, grades they've received, those factors alone have consistently been the best predictors of success in college. So, all right, we'll start there. But if you're dealing with this at a school that might be admitting 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 20, okay, everybody meets that criterion. So what do you do
Right.
next? And what I was able to get folks to talk about and think about is how, number one, they're really looking for evidence that the student's application, the submitted application, is purposeful. In other words, the student has a really good sense of what she wants to accomplish in college.
Yeah.
She's researched for herself what that is, and then she's researched institutions such that the decision to apply to XYZ college is because that institution rest at the end of her sense of purpose. In other words, she's found in that place the program, the opportunities, the instruction that will enable her to achieve her goals. And she can illustrate that synergy then that exists between herself and the place in the application. So this is something I think a lot of kids just don't think about is synergy. It's a
Hmm.
good SAT word, by the way, but we want to see, colleges want to see that intentional connectedness between the student in the institution.
Hmm.
So in the absence of testing, what they're really and they, even with testing, what they were really looking for is evidence that you really get it about us. You know what you want, and you see where we fit in your picture, and it makes sense. And we want to be part of. We want to invest in your success. We want to be part of your further ascent. So that's one thing. The other thing that's I think really important and a real opportunity for students now is the way they present. I like to use the term the invisible you. That part of the person that is not immediately visible to those around you. So in an essay, for example, students tend to kind of reflect back to their extracurricular activities and develop a resume narrative, or they talk about a trip they had, and that's nice, but that's really not revealing much about who you are. And the essay that offers that kind of revelation gets at, what do you think, how do you think, why do you think, what's important in your life, what's going on in the world that's impacted you. And what the admission officers are saying right now is, you guys are living history. What's going on every day in our world is historic in many ways, whether it's climate change, social justice, election laws, all kinds of things. How's that strike you? What do you think about that?
Absolutely.
And not that you have to be an activist on the front lines, but does this stuff matter to you? And the students who are able to show that kind of connectivity with things going on in their lives right now, they become very attractive to the very selective schools.
Yeah. It's funny sitting here listening to this, being many years now removed from the college admissions process. And my parallel
That long.
the parallel that I draw mentally is, it's similar to when you're applying for a job. The employer wants to get a better sense of who you are, why you want to work there, and how you see that helping your career and your talents and all of those things. So it's, obviously the goal here is to get into the college of your choice, but you can take those lessons learned from this process and apply them to yourself professionally long term. So
Yeah. I've talked with students for a long time about what I believe are 5 keys to success, and I think they're really important now too. Number one, they need to know themselves.
mhm.
Any time, whether it's COVID or not, if you enter into this process, starting with a list of colleges, you've already set yourself up for frustration, if not failure. You need to reflect first. So know yourself. Then, number two, you need to know what you're getting into. Know the process. And that's changed an awful lot in the last 12 months. Number three, and this is a very personal one for kids, they need to make good choices. And
Yeah.
they know when they're not making good choices, but every day of their lives is an opportunity to choose in such a manner that it could affect their opportunities in the next day.
Mhm.
Number four, when it's time to apply, they need to make sure that they use every part of the application to connect the dots, create a clear sense of the person being considered for admission. And then the one that seems kind of trivial but is really important is they need to number 5, they need to believe in themselves. And a lot of young people enter this process because they feel they're supposed to rather than because they want to. And so when they have that sense of self, that sense of purpose, that will carry them through the rough days of this process to very happy endings.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Peter, thank you so much for chatting with us today. We really appreciate it. We love being able to have these conversations to make sure that we are, up to date on all of the things taking place, because as we know, they're changing maybe by the hour, not even by the day. So big thank you. And we look forward to having more conversations with you as you complete the next 2 No Name conferences so that we can touch on the highlights and what we learned. So
Temperature's rising right now, so we'll see what happens in a
good.
few more weeks. But thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And we hope temperature rising in not in terms of fever, right? Let's make sure that we're staying healthy here.
Exactly.
Awesome. All right. Well, Peter, we will talk to you again soon. And for our listeners out here, thank you so much for participating. And if you have specific questions, please make sure to reach out so that we can get them answered and, ask Peter in future conversations.